Gospel of John records a very interesting conversation between Jesus and his disciples. They're in Jerusalem together, they're walking around, and they see a man who's been born blind from birth. And when Jesus' disciples see the man, they ask him why the man is blind, saying, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Now, many people, when they hear that question, think that's a rather insensitive thing for the disciples to ask. Why try to find someone to blame for this man's blindness? But from the perspective of the disciples, the logic seems clear enough. If something tragic has befallen someone, even something like a birth defect, then there must be some reason for it. And since God rewards those who obey him and punishes those who disobey him, it seems obvious enough that someone has done something wrong, something seriously wrong, if it merits a child being born without sight. You can see the same mindset in another book of the Bible, the book of Job. Job is a righteous man, and yet God allows Satan to bring pain and tragedy into his life. His children die, his property is stolen from him, and he contracts a terribly painful disease. And when his friends come to offer words of comfort, it's clear that they think in ways very similar to Jesus' disciples, because they assume, just like the disciples, that God rewards and blesses the righteous, and he punishes the wicked. As one of them says to Job, "Remember, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." In other words, I don't know what you did, Job, but you obviously did something. Because if you were innocent, if you were faithful, then you would be prospering. Of course, if you read until the end of the book, you'll discover God is not at all happy with what these friends say to Job. He doesn't think they're speaking the truth. Nor does Jesus agree with the logic of his disciples. He rebukes them and says that the reason the man was born blind has nothing to do with his or his parents' guilt. And we know this, don't we? We know that that's not how God works. Or at least we say we do. But, many Christians still think in these same terms. We may not express it as bluntly as the disciples or Job's friends, but often we still think that if you're faithful and obedient and you just do what God says, then he'll bless you. If you just pray hard enough, if you believe strongly enough, if you act dutifully enough, then God will reward you by making your business succeed, or giving you a happy marriage, or keeping all your children healthy. And just like Job's friends, and like Jesus' disciples, we believe that this is what the Bible teaches. And if you don't think so, if you don't believe that God rewards people for being obedient and he punishes people for their sin, all you have to do is read the book of Deuteronomy. More specifically, all you have to do is read Deuteronomy chapter 28. Because what does Deuteronomy 28 say? It says, if you obey God, he'll bless you and your life will go well. And if you disobey God, he'll punish you. You don't believe me? Just look at the first two verses. And if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the voice of the Lord your God. Conversely, what does Moses say will happen if you disobey God, if you fail to keep his commandments? But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Seems pretty straightforward, right? And based on these blessings and curses, it seems pretty clear why the disciples and why Job's friends would draw the conclusions they do. At least it makes sense why they might draw those conclusions. And why some Christians today might still think that as long as you're faithful and obey God, then he'll make you prosper. But I'd like to suggest that this is not what Deuteronomy is actually suggesting. In fact, I'll go further and say that not only does this section of Deuteronomy not teach some kind of merit-based reward system, it actually reinforces the message that Moses has been reiterating time and time again throughout this book, which is that our relationship with God is based not on good behavior and not on our religious performance, but rather and simply on the mercy and grace of God. To explain what I mean, I'm going to talk first about chapter 28 and what it says about all those blessings and curses. Then after that, I'm going to turn to what Moses says in chapters 29 and 30 as he recounts Israel's past relationship with God and anticipates what God will do in the future. So first, let's talk about chapter 28. What do we do with all these blessings and curses? One way to read this chapter, as I've already mentioned, is to read it as a kind of crude and simple system of punishment and reward. If you do what is good, God will make your life wonderful. If you do what you're not supposed to do, he'll make your life miserable. But there are several clues that suggest that perhaps there's more to these blessings and curses than that. First, and this is important, remember that when Moses says all these words, he's not speaking to an individual Israelite man or woman. He's talking to the people as a whole. When he says in verse 1, if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord. And then again in verse 15, if you will not obey the voice of the Lord. The you that he's using there, it's not a singular you. He's not making a promise to individual Israelites that they'll be rewarded or punished based on their own personal obedience. What he's saying to them is, here is what's going to happen if you as a nation follow or abandon God's laws. Furthermore, as Ellen Davis points out, there seems to be a kind of dark cloud overshadowing this whole chapter. And it seems to already anticipate that Israel will eventually fail to keep these laws. Blessing, she says, takes the lead, but it is outworded and outweighed by the rhetoric of horror and the curses, where destruction and exile are laid out so graphically and in such detail that they appear to be certainties. And reading on into the books of Kings and Lamentations, we indeed see them fulfilled. And I would add, you don't even have to read forward in the story to realize that the Israelites are likely going to fail to do what is being asked of them. Just look back on what they've done so far in Exodus and Leviticus. Just look back at what Moses reminds them of in the early chapters of Deuteronomy. They've already had a pretty poor track record when it comes to following the instructions of God. Why should the future be any different? So you see, although this chapter may seem at first glance to be promoting the idea that God blesses good people and curses bad people, and that whether you prosper or suffer is really up to you, there's something much deeper going on than that. Which leads us to what Moses says in the next two chapters as he reflects on the past and future of this people. Chapter 29 begins a new section of the book. The whole structure of Deuteronomy, as I've already mentioned, is modeled after the model of an ancient Near Eastern treaty between a sovereign and a vassal state. It began with a historical prologue, which described the past relationship of the two parties. It then moved on to a very long list of stipulations of the covenant, explaining what it is that the vassals now owe to their lord, with whom they are entering into covenant. That's what all those commandments were about. It also included a discussion of the blessings and curses that would follow as a result of keeping or breaking the covenant. You see that same kind of thing in these ancient Hittite treaties. And now, in chapter 29, the people are given an opportunity to renew the covenant that God made with them originally at Sinai. But notice how, as he begins to prepare them to renew the covenant, notice how Moses begins his speech to the people. You have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land. Why start this way? Why go all the way back to Egypt and start talking all over again about what God did in the past? It's because Moses is reminding them that this relationship they have with God, that they're about to renew, it is not based on anything they have done or on any favor that they have earned from God. Their relationship with the Lord has from the very beginning been a relationship based on the grace and mercy of God. You have seen, Moses says, all that he did for you. Remember how he rescued you and how he protected you, how he provided for you in the wilderness and gave you victory over your enemies. Therefore, he says in verse 9, therefore keep the words of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. You see how that changes things? How that changes the way we think about the blessings of God? What Moses is reminding the people of is that they didn't earn any of the many gifts God has already given them. His kindness to them, it's not some kind of quid pro quo for something they did. God has, from the very beginning, been the one who took the initiative. He is the one who consistently brought freedom and blessing into their lives. And therefore, as Moses says in verse 9, for this reason, because God is like that, you must keep the words of this covenant. It is in response to his goodness and his mercy to you that you must learn to trust him and do what he says. That's a very different thing than saying that as long as you do what you're supposed to, then God will reward you by making your life happy. What Moses is saying is, God has already made your life happy. He's already brought you into this land. He's already redeemed you. Your only job is to trust him enough to listen to him and live in the way he tells you. That's why Moses reminds them of their past. But notice also what he says to them about their future. Notice how chapter 30 begins. And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse. By this time, as Moses looks to the future, he's not speaking anymore in terms of if then. If you obey God, then he will bless you. If you disobey, then he will curse you. Because as he looks into the future, there's no real question of whether Israel will succeed. Their failure is certain. And that's why Moses says not if, but when. When all these things come upon you. When these curses come upon you, as they undoubtedly will. And what does he say after that? What hope does he give them? Does he do what Job's friends do and say, well, if you only get your act together, then God will bless you again? That's what you might expect him to say, but he doesn't, not really. He does anticipate that God will once again bless his people. He does say in verses 4 and 5 that the Lord will once again rescue his people and bring them back into the land, but not because they finally got their act together. Not because now they finally deserve it. Instead, notice what he says. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. And you shall again obey the voice of the Lord and keep all his commandments that I command you today. Before they have even entered the land, Moses already knows that they're going to break the covenant and disobey God's laws, and they're going to eventually be scattered from their home. He knows that because he knows this people. He has been with them for 40 years. He is fully aware of just how fickle and how faithless they can be. And yet, even knowing all that, he tells them that God will once again rescue them and restore them and bless them. And how will he do that? By doing what the people themselves cannot do. Moses says God himself will circumcise, will renovate their hearts, that God will cause them to love him and keep his commands. Centuries later, what Moses says does indeed come true. The people forget God, they abandon him, they put their trust in other gods, they break all his laws. And just as Moses said, curses do come upon them. But then after all that happens, God sends some prophets. And those prophets say things that sound very similar to what Moses told them on the plains of Moab. Like the prophet Jeremiah, through whom God says, "This is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." Or again, what he says to them through the prophet Ezekiel, "And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules." The promises that God makes through Jeremiah and Ezekiel are echoes of the promises he makes through Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 30. Yes, God says to his people, you will go astray. I know you will. But when you do, remember that just as I rescued you from Egypt, I am going to rescue you from your own fickle and faithless hearts. You won't be able to keep my commandments, but I will circumcise your heart. I will write my law on your heart. I will give you a new heart. And I will make it so that you will be able to enjoy my blessing no matter what it takes. That was Moses' message about blessing and curse. And with that in mind, you could see why Jesus rebuked his disciples and why God reprimanded Job's friends. Because their simple-minded ideas about reward and punishment was not true to how God relates to his people. They were treating God as if he's just some kind of cosmic agent of karma, rewarding those who live well or believe rightly and punishing those who don't. But that is not at all what God is like. And that is not how he relates to his people. The God of Deuteronomy is a God of grace who commits to a people in love, not because they've done anything to deserve it, but just because he loves them. And when they fail him and abandon his instructions, when they're ungrateful and disobedient, he doesn't just get mad and punish them. He takes it upon himself to fix them from the inside out, so that they will finally be able to enjoy the happiness and bliss that comes from following him.